The moment I should have left was not dramatic. No shouting. No slammed doors. No final words that echoed in memory. It was quiet. And that's why I stayed. I've learned that most life-altering mistakes don't announce themselves. They don't feel like mistakes at all. They feel reasonable, patient, adult. They feel like endurance, and we praise endurance far too often. I told myself I was being strong. What I was really doing was postponing pain. At the time, my life looked stable, predictable. From the outside, it made sense. That was the problem. Every reason to stay could be explained logically. Every doubt I had sounded emotional, impulsive, irresponsible. So I ignored it. I ignored the tightening in my chest every morning. I ignored the way silence between conversations felt heavier than arguments ever could. I ignored the subtle resentment growing inside me, not toward anyone else, but toward myself. I told myself that leaving would be selfish. That people depended on me. That walking away would create damage I wasn't willing to cause. That was the lie I built my life on. The truth is harder to admit. I stayed because leaving meant uncertainty. Staying meant decay, but it was familiar decay. Days began to repeat with terrifying precision. Wake up. Perform. Respond. Sleep. Repeat. I stopped marking time with memories and started marking it with obligations. Birthdays, meetings, anniversaries, all blended into the same neutral blur. I remember one evening in particular. I was sitting alone, lights off, the room illuminated only by the glow from the street outside. Cars passed. Voices drifted up from somewhere below. Life was happening, just not inside me. And I thought, very clearly, if nothing changes, this is my life. That thought should have scared me enough to act. Instead, it numbed me. Because accepting a future without change felt easier than risking one with loss. Over time, I became excellent at pretending. I learned how to sound present without being honest. How to smile without meaning it. How to reassure others while quietly abandoning myself. There's a special kind of loneliness that comes from being needed but not seen. From being reliable but not alive. People praised me for my patience, my loyalty, my stability. No one asked if I was okay. And I never volunteered the answer. I watched opportunities pass, not because I didn't see them, but because taking them would have required me to admit that I wanted more. And wanting more felt dangerous. Wanting more implied dissatisfaction. And dissatisfaction threatened the fragile peace I had constructed. So I stayed. I stayed when my body was telling me no. I stayed when my curiosity died. I stayed when laughter felt borrowed instead of natural. I told myself I would leave someday. When the timing was better. When circumstances changed. When it hurt less. Someday became years. The breakdown didn't come as a collapse. It came as an absence. One morning, I woke up and realized I felt nothing about the day ahead. No dread. No excitement. Just indifference. That indifference terrified me more than pain ever had. Because pain means something matters. Indifference means you've already lost. I realized then that staying hadn't spared me suffering, it had only delayed it, stretched it thin across time, diluted it into something harder to recognize and harder to escape. I hadn't chosen this life because it was right. I had chosen it because it was easier than leaving. And once I saw that clearly, I couldn't unsee it. The question was no longer if I should leave. The question was whether I had waited too long. Once the thought, "I waited too long," settled inside me, everything changed. Not outwardly. Outwardly, I still showed up. Still fulfilled expectations. Still said the right things at the right time. But internally, time began to feel aggressive, like it was pushing against me, demanding an answer I had been avoiding. I started noticing how often I said, "Later. Later, I'll think about it. Later, I'll change something. Later, I'll choose myself." Later became a shield. And a prison. What I didn't want to admit was that staying had already cost me something irreversible. Not a job. Not a relationship. Something quieter and far more dangerous. Momentum. When you stay too long, leaving no longer feels like a step forward. It feels like a collapse. You've invested years into a version of yourself that no longer fits, and walking away feels like declaring those years wasted. That fear kept me frozen. I began bargaining with myself. If I couldn't leave entirely, maybe I could shrink my expectations. Make life smaller. Less demanding. Less disappointing. I told myself I didn't need passion, just peace. I didn't need purpose, just stability. But the body knows when you're lying. Sleep became shallow. I woke up tired, even after long nights. My patience shortened. Sounds irritated me. Conversations felt heavy. I felt trapped inside a role that required constant maintenance but gave nothing back. There were moments when I caught myself fantasizing about disappearance. Not death, just absence. Starting over somewhere no one knew my history. No explanations. No performance. That scared me. Because those thoughts weren't dramatic. They were calm. Logical. Practical. I started pulling away emotionally, even though I stayed physically. I gave less of myself to avoid feeling the cost of giving everything. That withdrawal created distance, quiet, invisible distance, and people noticed. They asked if something was wrong. I said no. That was another lie. The truth was harder to say. I was afraid that if I spoke honestly, I wouldn't be able to stop. There came a moment, small, unremarkable, that finally tipped the balance. I was listening to someone talk about their future plans. Big plans. Risky plans. They spoke with that dangerous brightness in their voice, the kind that only exists when someone still believes in possibility. I smiled. Encouraged them. Said all the right supportive things. And then I felt it, sharp, sudden grief. Not jealousy. Grief. For the version of myself that used to speak that way. For the person I might have been if I had left earlier. For the years I spent convincing myself that wanting more was childish. That grief didn't pass. It followed me home. Sat with me in silence. Stayed through the night. That's when I understood something essential. Staying had not protected anyone. It had only protected appearances. The damage I feared causing by leaving had already happened. It was just happening to me, slowly, invisibly, without witnesses. I had become someone who survived days instead of living them. And the worst part? I had normalized it. That realization hurt more than regret ever had. Leaving, I finally understood, was not an act of courage. It was an act of honesty. And honesty is brutal when you've avoided it for too long. So I started preparing, not externally, but internally. I stopped making long-term promises. I stopped reinforcing narratives that depended on me staying forever. I allowed myself to imagine a future that did not include this version of my life. The guilt was immense. I questioned myself constantly. Am I exaggerating? Am I ungrateful? Am I running away instead of fixing things? Every doubt sounded responsible. Every impulse to leave sounded selfish. But beneath all that noise was a simple truth I could no longer ignore: I was disappearing in this life. And staying longer wouldn't make leaving easier. It would only make it more devastating. The day I finally decided to leave, truly decided, nothing external changed. No announcement. No dramatic scene. Just a quiet internal shift. I chose myself without applause. Without certainty. Without knowing if it would work. I knew only one thing. If I stayed, would never forgive myself. And that was a future I could not survive. Leaving did not feel like freedom. It felt like standing on the edge of something without knowing whether the ground would appear beneath my feet. I had imagined that the moment I chose myself, something inside me would click into place. Relief. Confidence. Certainty. That's how stories usually sell it, like clarity arrives as a reward. It didn't. What arrived instead was silence. And fear. When you stay too long, leaving doesn't just remove you from a situation, it strips you of an identity. I had spent years being the reliable one, the stable one, the person who stays. Walking away meant losing not only people and routines, but the version of myself that made sense to others. For a while, I felt unanchored. Like I had stepped out of a moving vehicle and was still trying to remember how to stand still. There were days when I doubted everything. Days when I questioned whether I had exaggerated my pain. Whether I had destroyed something salvageable. Whether comfort, even empty comfort, would have been enough if I had tried harder. But then there were moments, quiet, unremarkable moments, that told me the truth. I noticed that I could breathe again. That my thoughts had space. That time felt open instead of oppressive. I began to understand that the life I left wasn't evil or wrong. It simply wasn't mine anymore. And staying would have required me to keep shrinking myself until nothing remained. The guilt didn't disappear. It softened, but it stayed. I carry the knowledge that my leaving caused confusion, disappointment, maybe even pain. I don't rewrite that part of the story to make myself feel better. Choosing yourself doesn't erase consequences. It just makes them honest. What changed was my relationship with regret. Before, regret was passive, a dull ache I ignored while time slipped away. Now, regret became something sharper, but cleaner. I regretted waiting so long. I regretted my silence. I regretted the years I spent convincing myself that endurance was virtue. But I no longer regretted leaving. That difference matters more than I can explain. Starting over didn't make my life extraordinary. There was no dramatic transformation. No sudden happiness. No instant purpose. What it gave me was authorship. I began making smaller, truer choices. Not choices that looked impressive from the outside, but ones that felt aligned inside my body. I learned to listen to discomfort instead of numbing it. To treat dissatisfaction as information instead of a flaw. Some days are still heavy. Some nights are still quiet in ways that ache. But the silence now feels chosen, not imposed. And that changes everything. If you're listening to this and you're standing where I once stood, staying because leaving feels selfish, irresponsible, or too late, I want you to hear this clearly: it is never too late to stop abandoning yourself. Staying doesn't make you noble if it costs you your presence. Endurance is not the same as meaning. And comfort, when it becomes suffocation, is not safety, it's erosion. You don't owe your life to a version of yourself that no longer exists. I stayed when I should have left. And I paid for that with years I can't recover. But leaving, even late, taught me something essential. A life lived consciously, even imperfectly, is worth more than a life endured quietly. I don't know exactly where I'm going. I don't pretend to have answers. But for the first time, my life is moving because I am choosing it, not because I am afraid to stop. And that, finally, feels like being alive.